We are talking today with Paul Wright. Paul Wright is the founder and editor of Prison Legal News. He is also the author of several books, including Prison Nation, The Warehousing of America's Poor, The Selling of America, an inside look at the U.S. prison industry. And he is here to talk about his latest book, which he co-authored along with Tara J. Harville, entitled Prison Profiteers, Who Makes Money from Mass Incarceration. If you could start out briefly, tell us a little bit about Prison Legal News.
Prison Legal News is an independent monthly magazine. I started it while I was in prison here in Washington State in 1990, and we've been publishing monthly ever since. We've grown from a hand-typed 10-page newsletter with a circulation of around 75 to a 48-page offset press magazine. Our circulation is around 7,000 copies right now. People can see more about Prison Legal News on our website at www.prisonlegalnews.org. And in addition to the magazine, we also run our website and do the occasional book.
Tell me, what was the motivation in writing your current book, Prison Profiteers?
Well, the big thing about Prison Profiteers is pretty different from other books on the market. As a criminal justice activist, I'm pretty familiar with most stuff that's on the market, and having done 2 books prior to this, I was noticing that pretty much all the books, including my own prior to this one, kind of focus on who is being harmed by current criminal justice policies. It's not enough to say that, well, there's 2.3 million people locked up, 4,000 or 5,000 people every year dying in prison because of brutality or medical neglect or communicable diseases that are easily prevented. That's kind of obvious. And having thought about, okay, we've been there and done that, what's the next step? And so I thought the next step, and I'm doing kind of a survey of what's out there. And one of the good things about being the editor of a magazine is everyone sends you review copies of their book. So we have a pretty good idea of what everyone else is doing. And so it occurred to me that, what no one was doing was no one was looking at who's benefiting from current criminal justice policies. And there was a report that came out not too long ago. The Bureau of Justice Statistics, they issue reports every year about how much money is being spent on the criminal justice system. I think at this point, the last one that came out, I think as of 2005, here in the United States, state, local, and the federal government are spending around $80 billion a year just on prisons and jails. If you factor in police spending and court spending, it's much higher. But $80 billion a year is being spent on prisons and jails. And it's enough, and I think it's not enough to say that, well, the money's being spent, but who's getting the money? And that's what Prison Profiteers kind of sets out to do. And it's, in a lot of respects, it's about one of the biggest transfers of public wealth in the way of tax money into private hands in American history.
All right, so maybe start out and tell us what companies are profiting from this. I know one of the ones I'd heard of in the past was a company called Wackenhut.
Yes, Wackenhut changed their name to Geo Corporation. The players in the prison industry range from there's basically a lot of different players that are profiting from mass imprisonment, and they're doing so rather handsomely. And the private prison companies are some of the most obvious ones. Geo Corporation, Corrections Corporation of America, Cornell Corrections, these are some of the companies. And basically what they've done is they build prisons. In some cases they build prisons, they also operate prisons, and they take prisoners on contract. In fact, Washington State has over 1,000 prisoners being held in Corrections Corporation of America prisons in Nevada and other states far from here. So you've got Washington tax money going to a Tennessee-based corporation to house its prisoners elsewhere. And one of the things, and at this point, roughly 6 to 7% of the 2.3 million people that are held in prison are being held in private prisons. And the private prison industry has been pretty much marked by mismanagement, corruption, a lot of problems, and basically their premise has been that they can run prisons cheaper than the government can. And that's true, they can. But the difference is that the taxpayers don't realize any savings, because the savings, the quote savings that the private prison industry obtains is basically profits in the is basically profit for their shareholders. So as far as taxpayers getting a deal or whatever, that's just not there. And the more interesting thing is that as far as the profits of the private prison industry does realize is, on the one hand, they chintz the prisoners on everything from health care to clothing to any type of rehabilitation services or whatever. But the biggest chiseling that they do is on the staffing. And this is the thing, is that when the operating costs of prisons, 80% of the operating costs of a prison have to do with the staffing, how much the guards are paid, how much the administrators are paid. And whereas in a lot of states, private or public prison guards, for example, in New Jersey or Connecticut or California, being a prison guard is actually a pretty decent job. It's prison guards are starting out at $40,000, $50,000 a year, and after a few years on the job, they're making $70,000 or $80,000 a year with very good benefits. And by contrast, the private prison companies, they're paying their guards anywhere from $7 or $8 an hour, and it's no coincidence that for the most part, virtually all the private prisons are south of the Mason-Dixon line and the so-called right-to-work states. None of them employ union guards. Their guard force is not unionized. They have low wages, very high turnover, and very little in the way of benefits. And that's one of the reasons how they effectuate these so-called cost savings, which is basically just profit for their shareholders.
And is the private prison industry building the prisons themselves, is that a pretty booming business?
Some of the private prison companies do build their own prisons. One of their big thing has been building prisons on spec, as they put it, where basically even when they have no contracts with the state or even the federal government, they'll build a prison. I guess you could call it the field of dreams strategy, is build it and they will come. Or in this case, build it and we'll lock them up. And so they do that. And there's also been a thing, a number of counties, impoverished counties in Texas, Arizona, a number of other places have also gotten into this, where they'll build jails on speculation far beyond their needs. They'll build massive excess capacity with the objective of renting it out to either the federal government, state government, or whatever, and they tout this as basically a means of economic development, where they otherwise have none.
Yeah, because you hear about that from time to time in the news, where particular counties that aren't doing well financially, which seems to be a growing number of counties, consider having prisons built there. So
Yes.
What's the truth to the how the finances of running these prisons affects a county?
Well, we've got one of the articles that we've got in Prison Profiteers is by Clayton Mosher and some other professors at the University of Washington branch down in Vancouver. And they kind of expose the myth and the hype and the lies about the use of prisons as tools of economic development. And I think what's happened is that you have very poor, distressed rural communities that basically are dying communities. And they kind of see prisons as a last gasp measure to try to remain solvent or alive as communities. And the states then invest hundreds of millions of dollars building prisons in these places, kind of as an attempt to put the town on life support, so to speak. And what's interesting is that what we're seeing in a lot of parts of the country is that these prisons have been built in these rural communities, and the problem they're having now is staffing them, because, believe it or not, a lot of people don't want to live in these rural communities that are otherwise dead, but for a prison, and they're in the middle of nowhere. In fact, literally within the last 2 weeks or so, the state of Texas, despite having a massively overcrowded prison system, has announced that they were closing down 3 prison units in West Texas because they couldn't find the guards to staff them. And that comes down to the thing of who wants to live in the middle of the West Texas desert? And apparently not too many people do. And this has also been one of the issues in California, where some California prisons were built in the high desert mountains around Susanville and places like that. And so the state invests $200–300 million building these massive 5,000-bed prisons in California, and then they can't staff them. Here in Washington, the DOC is also having a hard time staffing its prisons. And here in Washington, they've used the rural prison building thing as an economic development. I won't call it strategy, I'd call it a ploy, kind of trying to breathe life into otherwise dying communities.
Talk a little bit about prison labor itself. We hear stories about how bad prison labor is in, let's say, China. But I know that Washington State here just recently wrestled with some legislation about using prison labor here locally.
Yes, Prison Legal News has had the best, the most comprehensive coverage of prison slave labor issues in the United States of pretty much any publication, and we've kind of single-handedly put it on the map. And it's really an ideological issue, is that prison slave labor, if used in China, is bad. If it's used in America, it's great. And this hypocrisy is kind of reflected by the fact that the United States government makes it a federal crime to import goods made by prison labor anywhere else in the world into the United States. But on the other hand, the United States exports goods made by American prisoners to other countries, including Japan, Europe, Mexico, Nicaragua, and other places. All three books, all three Prison Legal News anthologies, The Selling of America, Prison Nation, Prison Profiteers, have covered the issue of prison slave labor here in America. One of the articles that we have in Prison Profiteers, which is pretty fascinating, is kind of how the intersection between prison slavery in America and imperialist wars overseas is the fact that something most people don't know is the fact that federal prison industry sells over $800 million a year to the Department of Defense. And this ranges from, you've got American prisoners, 25% of whom I will add are not U.S. citizens, laboring away to make everything from Kevlar helmets, body armor, tow missile wires, cluster bomb cases, and uniforms and other items for the Department of Defense. And these are numbers that have gone up steadily since the United States invaded Afghanistan and Iraq. And one of the more interesting things, too, is that we've also note in our book is the fact that the mandatory nature of prison slave labor. I think some of its defenders say, well, it's voluntary and the prisoners want to work. And one of the things that our reporter, Ian Urbina, who now works for the New York Times, found was that you have political prisoners like several of the 1993 World Trade Center bombers were being forced to work in Unicor factories to make goods for the U.S. military, and they objected rather strenuously to it, and sort of basically being told they'd be punished more harshly if they didn't participate in this form of prison labor. And so, but it's also interesting too is, you wonder how good of a job are members of Al-Qaeda doing when they're making war material for the U.S. military, but the U.S. government and its prison system doesn't think that's a big issue.
So give us a picture for here in Washington State. What is, compared to other states, what do our prisons look like?
As far as what?
Compared to, let's start with the prison labor issue.
The prison labor issue, Washington has historically been one of the top states in its use of prison slave labor by private corporations, and temporarily that was ended in 2004 when the Washington Supreme Court held that it violated the state constitution to I think the legal term from the original Constitution was to let out the labor of Washington prisoners to private corporations. And up until that point, roughly 300 prisoners were employed by what's called Class 3 industries here in Washington, working for companies that subcontracted for for a number of larger corporations. The big corporations that have exploited prison slave labor here in Washington include Microsoft, Boeing, Starbucks, Nintendo, Planet Hollywood, Eddie Bauer, a couple others. One of the big stories that Prison Legal News broke in 1994, I don't know if you were you in Washington at that time? Okay. Was Congressman Jack Metcalf. He ran for office in District 2, which is the congressional district for Everett. He ran for office on a tough-on-crime platform, and he used prisoners at the Washington State Reformatory in a telemarketing operation to get out the vote for him. So he had basically murderers, rapists, pedophiles, and robbers calling up voters to tell him how tough on crime he was. And PLN broke the story. Unfortunately, it got no attention until after the election, at which point it made the front page. It made the front page of all the dailies in the state. And that was an election that he won by 600 votes. But anyways, that was one of that's just kind of one example of the use of prison slave labor here in Washington by people that are happy to bash prisoners otherwise. And I think that kind of exposes one of the contradictions in the use of prison slave labor here in the United States. Is on the one hand, prisoners have been vilified, they've been demonized, there's a whole cottage industry of politicians, media pundits, police and guard unions who literally make a very lucrative living bashing prisoners. On the other hand, you've got corporations and companies that their bottom line interest is, well, the pursuit of the bottom line. And they want to cut costs and make as much money as possible. So the use of prison slave labor is an attractive proposition, but there's a PR price. And when Prison Legal News and the Seattle Weekly broke the story that Nintendo and Starbucks were using prisoners at the Monroe Correctional Complex at the Twin Rivers unit to package their products, it's like, well, we'd just soon not had the story get out, but we're going to keep doing it. And the Twin Rivers unit houses Washington Sex Offender Treatment Program, and 85 or 95% of the prisoners there are sex offenders. So I thought it was the height of irony to have sex offenders packaging children toys for Nintendo. But anyways, if it makes $1, we can't get in the way of that.
Talk about other industries that are reaping benefits from the prison industry. I would imagine healthcare is one of those.
Healthcare is a huge issue. Basically, healthcare consumes a large and ever-increasing portion of prison budgets, and there's been a big push. There is a big push. Basically, no one wants to spend money on healthcare for prisoners, and there's kind of a contradiction there because the Constitution, the Eighth Amendment, requires that the states and the federal government provide medical care for prisoners. In fact, prisoners are the only segment of American society that have a legal right to health care. Unfortunately, like a lot of legal rights we have, it's not a very great one. So prison health care is a huge issue in this country. There's a number of private corporations, fairly large ones. Prison Health Services and Correctional Medical Services are the two biggest ones in the country. There's a number of smaller players like Wexford and EMSA, who basically what their function is they come into states and jails, and they'll say, you pay us the money, you just give us the money, and we will provide all the medical care for your prison population on a per diem. And typically their contracts run on a per diem basis. So if, say, for example, the state of Washington has 20,000 prisoners, PHS or one of these companies would negotiate a contract of, give us $20 a day for every prisoner, and we'll handle all your medical stuff. Washington is one of the states that does not use these companies, fortunately. But around probably 26 or 28 states at any given time, and a majority of the jails around the country use these companies. And the problem is that these are privately held companies. They're in business to make money, and they're being paid on a per diem basis they're being paid on a per diem basis to provide medical care. Well, the bottom line is that the less care they provide, the more money they make. So it's a pretty perverse incentive to ensure that adequate medical care isn't being given. And this isn't to say that medical care is better in government-run prisons, because it isn't. It's kind of a rotten oranges and a rotten apples comparison. But the difference is that when a government prison withholds needed medical care and someone dies, the prison medical doctor or the warden didn't get a bonus because that person died from having medical care withheld. And that's exactly what happens in the private prison companies that provide medical care. We kind of call them the HMOs from hell. And everything that's wrong with managed health care for non-prisoners is pretty much magnified and increased greatly when you transfer it into a prison setting.
What other industries are reaping benefits in the prison system?
The telephone industry is one. That's a pretty big one. Prison telephone calls are roughly a $1 billion a year industry, with the exception of New York and Nebraska. All states around the country receive kickbacks from the telephone companies. In other words, the telephone companies come in, tell a state, look, you give us the exclusive monopoly to handle phone calls from your prison population, and we'll give you a kickback on those calls. And the kickbacks range anywhere from 40 to 60% of gross billed revenues. Here in Washington, last time I looked at one of the contracts, it was around 50 or 53%. And so the companies aren't giving up that money out of their pocket or their profit margins. They're passing along to the consumer. So the result here is that, for example, a 15-minute call from a Washington state prisoner out of state is like a $20 or $24 call. And as I mentioned earlier, with this whole thing about building prisons in rural areas, usually far from the communities that the prisoners come from, here in Washington, the bulk of the prison population comes from King, Snohomish, and Pierce County. And there are no prisons in King County. And there's one prison in Snohomish County, or there's the Monroe Correctional Complex in Snohomish County. There's McNeil Island in Pierce County. The rest of the state's prisons are all in eastern Washington or on the Olympic Peninsula or southwestern Washington, which is pretty far from where the prisoners are from and their families live. And so that leaves the telephone as the best means to maintain contact and community ties with family members. And basically, Washington, the Washington state government, the Washington State Department of Corrections, like pretty much every other prison system in the country, has decided to tap into this as a means of reaping financial gain. And the telephone industry is happy to accommodate them. So the key thing, though, is in every other thing when contracts are being put out, is who's going to provide the best service at the lowest cost. When it comes to prison telephone contracts, it's just the opposite. Who's going to provide the service and give the state the highest kickback, which means who's going to provide the service for the largest amount of money. And the whole field is rife with corruption and sleaziness. For example, here in Washington State, just a week or two ago, the State Utilities Commission fined AT&T $300,000 for overbilling people who accepted phone calls from prisoners at Airway Heights in the state penitentiary. And this is in the context that they overbilled on top of the outrageous rates they already charge. So this is kind of like, the extra gouge, so to speak. And this is an ongoing thing around the country. Washington's no different in that respect.
Who's in charge of oversight for the different corporations that are making money off the prison industry?
Well, that's pretty much the issue, is there is no oversight. One of the things that's happened in a lot of states, and this is in the context of Prison Legal News, we've been covering the private prison industry since we started in 1990. And it's pretty much every, the private prison industry is, it's been rife with, riots, killings, rapes, escapes, at much higher rates than government prisons are. For example, just to give you a comparison, is the number of rebellions and uprisings in private prisons tends to be a lot higher than it is at government prisons. One of the reasons this is directly related to staffing. You understaff the prison, there's inadequate supervision, and that makes for a fairly unsafe environment for the prisoners and the staff alike. And what comes out of these in these little post-mortem reports and audits and stuff like that is, well, the states pay the private prison companies X amount of money to house the prisoners, and sometimes their contracts will say, okay, we're giving you X amount of money, $60 a day for every prisoner there, you have to do this. And that'll be everything from maintaining a certain level of staffing to providing certain services. But then the problem is that most of the states never thought to provide monitors, contract monitors, to ensure that those services are actually being provided. And especially when prisoners are being transferred out of state, like, for example, Washington State. It has 1,000 prisoners in CCA prisons in Arizona. And the monitoring of these contracts tends to be either non-existent or very minimal. There's little in the way of on-site monitoring, and typically the stuff doesn't become an issue until there's an incident. And then even when there is an incident, there tends to be no downside for the companies because it's just the cost of doing business. And we're back to the less they provide in the way of services, staffing, medical care, treatment, whatever, the more money they make. And, the occasional killing, the occasional riot, no big deal. It's all the cost of doing business.
Talk briefly about the juvenile facilities. That seems to be a booming business as well.
Yes, two of the big booming businesses for the private prison industry has been juveniles and immigration. As far as the juvenile systems go around the country, the incarceration of juveniles tends to be a lot more cost and time intensive than adult prisons, and that's because, at least nominally, most states officially have the philosophy that prisoners that are sent to the juvenile system are there for rehabilitation and to basically try to help get their lives on track, as opposed to with the adult prison systems. Pretty much as a general rule, I don't think anyone even pretends that rehabilitation is, even in the top 10 or 15 list of priorities as far as what's going on in adult prisons. But with the juveniles, it's at least nominally still on the agenda. And one of the things that's happened is that a lot of states have thought that, dealing with kids, and kids are a more difficult population to deal with. I think anyone involved on criminal justice issues, including the officials themselves, would admit that kids are a lot, it's a different population. One of the key things is that children in prison need to be provided with an education. The whole goal is to get them out of the juvenile prison system so they can lead productive lives. And usually at that age, an education is a big thing. A lot of them have mental health issues, serious mental health issues that need treatment. They have substance abuse issues that also need treatment. And basically what's happened with a lot of states, Maryland is one of them, the state of Florida is another, is they kind of just throw up their hands and, this is hard and it's going to cost some money. So there's a number of corporations and companies that they literally specialize in juvenile prisons. Correctional Services Corporation out of Florida is one. Youth Services International is another. And what they do is they come in and tell the states, look, you give us X amount of money per diem for every prisoner, and it might be and the amounts are pretty high. They tend to be well over $100 a day per kid, anywhere from $100 to $160 a day. And let us run your juvenile prison system, and you don't have to worry about anything. And that's what they do. And usually the body count ensues after that. And the private prison industry, some of their biggest hits as far as litigation, and that has come up from their mismanagement of juvenile facilities, and that's because I think juries find it more outrageous when the private prison industry murders children through medical neglect or brutality than they do when they do the same thing to adults.
All right. Well, I want to thank you very much for spending time with us today.
Okay. Thank you.